so I'm from kind of a small town in Wales, and I think through my final year in uni, I was starting to question things in different ways, and I started to understand how this had an impact on how I was looking at the world. And I think I wanted to understand how I could practice architecture without kind of restricting myself to just buildings, and try to start addressing the social inequalities that I was kind of seeing in the world to ultimately have a positive impact on people. So this is me. So I just want to kind of lay out me. So I'm obviously white, cisgendered, kind of straight, able-bodied woman. And I'm here to talk about my final year project, but very much not here to kind of be the voice of sex workers. I don't represent this community. This was kind of just something I was really passionate about in my final year, and something I have a big interest in. But I do think it's really important to say that we can't just let the communities who are dealing with the inequalities to kind of try and dismantle the systems that they didn't build on their own. So I think to have people in privileged positions like myself to kind of spark these conversations is really good. So I'm really happy to be here. So my project was called In Cracks of Exploitation. The overall theme for the year was a theme of health, and we could kind of take that however we wanted. Every student took it in a completely different way, which was really exciting, but my interest was more on the kind of mental health side and sex work in particular. So when research and I kind of started to understand that Bristol had a really big problem of street sex work, and kind of with the exposure of these really harsh conditions that they were working in. And because sex work is kind of so enriched with these heavy stigmas and prejudices, when people are trying to exit street sex work, they can often feel kind of underrepresented, alienated, and unsupported within society. So I thought it's really important to kind of lay out the situation for sex workers in the UK right now. So the act of engaging in sex as part of an exchange of sexual services for money is actually legal. But any sort of related activities, for example, selling sex on the street, which is otherwise known as curb crawling, managing a brothel, all of these things are classed as crimes. And because of this law on brothel keeping, it means that two sex workers cannot work under the same kind of roof because it's classed as being a brothel. And it kind of starts pushing sex work underground and becomes much more unsafe. Something else to point out is that sex work and trafficking are very different things. Unfortunately, sex workers are often kind of pushed into this box with sex trafficking and kind of punished for things that is a completely different problem. And then another issue is how, well, because of the kind of nature of the work, no one really knows an exact figure, but it has been said that it's increased, the number of sex workers in the UK has increased by a huge amount since the government brought in austerity. So going on to my project. So for people who know Bristol, you probably know where this is, but the site was kind of bordering St. Werburgh's and St. Paul's, and two very different spaces. St. Paul's is very vibrant, lots of different communities, ethnicities and races, but lots going on. Similarly to St. Werburgh's, it's very creative, but slightly more of a kind of white middle class demographic. So you have these two different kind of demographics next to each other. And I started, so these figures were kind of taken in 2018, so this might have been different now. But when I started looking at the numbers, these were from a charity in Bristol, and there were currently at that time 127 women who were classed as street sex workers. And when you start looking at the figures that come with that, it's actually really shocking and quite hard to read. So these are a few of them. So they're 99% are addicted to one or more class A drug or alcohol. Then 92% suffer from malnutrition. They're 12 times more likely to get murdered. 80% experience homelessness, and all suffer from a chronic ill health. And I think these statistics are so shocking, and for a particular community that's clearly receiving very little support, it was something that I wanted to kind of pick up in the project. And then looking at the kind of hierarchy of sex workers, it's really important to stress that this project was very much based on street sex workers. There's a huge difference between kind of high-end escort workers, where they're kind of selling sex, but usually for much more money and in safer conditions, whereas street sex work comes with a lot more kind of layered issues in terms of kind of safety and criminalization. And so, as you can imagine, when you type into Google brothels in Bristol, not a lot really comes up. And it's because of the nature of it being pushed underground, it's really hard to kind of get a grasp of the problem within Bristol. So I started trying to understand it through the kind of red light district. So you probably all are aware of a red light district. So it's basically any sort of sex work, sex shops, strip clubs, but all concentrated within one kind of cluster. And we know that all class systems kind of oppose the idea of sex businesses kind of popping up in their area. But the kind of police's approach to this is that in order to make areas seem more middle class, they kind of push sex work underground, which makes it much more of a vulnerable position to work in. We know the kind of red light districts often pop up in these working class areas due to the kind of middle and upper class residential districts. They have more financial investments. So it's much easier for this kind of activity to start popping up in these kind of lower and working class areas. So I wanted to kind of relate that back to Bristol and our site. So it kind of it's called a zone in transition, which kind of surrounds the central business district, and it's kind of the inner city area, and our site lies directly within that. And I was really interested in this idea of visibility. And in the UK, any sort of indecent material has to be kind of boarded up, and you have to give a warning notice. So everything is very much unseen and hidden, and it allows very little visibility of what's actually happening behind. And when you kind of contrast that to places like Amsterdam, we're all aware of the red light district in Amsterdam. It's very visible. Women tend to kind of stand behind a glass wall, and kind of the services are on display. You kind of know what you're paying for before you buy it. And it's become this kind of level of an art form, but it also brings a level of safety as well. And then looking at kind of the taboo around sex. So people kind of don't talk about it because it's an uncomfortable subject, that everyone has in their mind this idea of this nuclear family and like these perfect relationships. But there's so much more that comes with this idea of relationships and sex. And by not talking about them and it becoming this taboo, it becomes something that's really unsafe. Which leads kind of leaded me to try and understand the idea of this in terms of kind of body image. So we know that society has this kind of particular ideal that it expects a woman to be. So we expect her to dress a certain way, look a certain way, and kind of fit in with these gendered boundaries that we don't even create ourselves. So when anyone steps outside of those kind of boundaries, it immediately kind of gives them less respect. And it kind of boils down to the women that are acceptable to men and therefore acceptable to society are the ones that tend to get the most help. And then, which leads on to the idea of objectification. So we know the sex workers, a lot of them feel empowered by their work, and particularly high-end escorts. But when it comes to street sex work, it comes with lots of different levels of difficulties and safeties. Clients often see these workers as just prostitutes, and this is because that's the way that society paints them. But we know that the majority of sex workers are actually mothers. They have jobs, they have bills to pay, and they have emotions and aspirations just like all of us as well. But by disassociating these things with the sex worker, it means they're working in much more vulnerable positions. So I started trying to understand what services there were in Bristol already. And the charity 125, which is based in St. Paul's, was one which was really important. So they have two main services. Number one is their drop-in centre. So it's it's kind of just one room there. They're trying to make it really homely. People can go there to shower, to eat, or get advice. But it's basically essentially trying to make a safe, homely environment for people to access when they need to. And then their second service is a outreach van, which kind of drives through the main areas which are known for street sex workers to be working along. This one is in Easton, and they kind of provide kind of food, condoms, and just making sure that where they are working, they're safe, as safe as they can be. And this idea of their service, like creating this sense of home, really interested me. And I was trying to understand the idea of a home. And I know that, yeah, the kind of definition of home completely changes from one person to the next. But when you spatially try and think of home, it often surrounds the idea of a kitchen. So it's often the hub of the home. It's energetic, there's aromas, and lots of people tend to socialize in the kitchen. And you have these kind of different levels of privacy coming off, maybe in terms of a living room or a bedroom, which then naturally led me on to kind of looking at precedence analysis. So for those of you that don't know what Maggie centres are, they're basically centres for cancer patients, often patients who are coming to kind of end of life. So it's really important to make comfortable spaces, and something that kind of resonates with the ideas that I was trying to grasp in my project. So first of all, looking at the Glasgow Maggie Centre by Rem Coolhouse. So the plan is kind of centred around this internal courtyard and surrounded by kind of external greenery. And every space within the building looks onto either this courtyard or the greenery outside. And it kind of has this relaxing and soothing atmosphere to it. And then next, going on to the Manchester Maggie Centre, which is by Norman Foster, which is a completely different building, but the same brief. And it just shows another way of doing it. So it's almost developed along this kind of spine and has different shapes and sizes of rooms coming off, which creates different levels of intimacy, both inside and outside of the building. And I wanted to start trying to understand how can I help people who are trying to exit sex work and what will be beneficial for them as well. And something that cropped up quite a few times was the idea of ceramic arts and pottery. It's often related to the healing processes because it's something that you have to put a lot of concentration into, and you kind of take your mind off other things by putting all your energy into this kind of particular art. And I think a lot of people go into this rehabilitation centre feeling disempowered, and this healing process can help them become more of an empowered person leaving the rehabilitation process. And then I was relating this back to the kind of pottery process. So it starts off in this greenware kind of position where the material is kind of soft and malleable, and it goes through this long process where in the end it's something this glaze fired, is something that's hard, is something that is kind of finished and something to be proud of. And again, looking at that through the rehabilitation process. So it's something that when you enter rehabilitation, you're often in a vulnerable position, but trying to give them the tools that they need to become a much stronger person when leaving rehabilitation. So which led to the concept. So the concept was kind of, as I've said before, looking at how we see a very small glimpse into this world of sex work and trying to emphasize these seen and unseen elements through the building and the design. So zooming out a bit, the master plan was aiming to kind of give the site a kind of civic heart, I guess. Bristol's known to be really creative. There's lots going on, and particularly within the arts, but a lot of it is kind of city centre based. And it does kind of spread up to Gloucester Road and other areas, but St. Werburgh's does have a kind of arty nature to it, but there's nothing kind of physically which was bringing people up to that area. So I wanted this kind of creative sprawl to put a pinpoint on the map so people using this service can kind of inspire the next generation of people that come after them. And then kind of a smaller scale, I wanted to kind of keep this green corridor coming from the city centre to make sure that the space is accessible by foot and by bike as safely as possible. And I started like really quickly mapping out what kind of spaces you need. So within kind of ceramic studios, galleries and rehabilitation centres, and how do you kind of spatially put a kind of number to those, which came with the biggest challenge of how do you make a building of such a kind of domestic nature and that is so sensitive in such a public site. So I came up with these key kind of 5 design ideas. So number 1 was the public and private boundaries. So I wanted a really distinct difference between the rehabilitation centre, which is private, and the ceramic art gallery and studio, which is a much more public building. The use of vegetation and planting would be used to kind of direct people and as thresholds. We know that the planting is really good for rehabilitation and healing. So this is another aspect that I can bring to the project. The idea of courtyards, so different size courtyards with different levels of intimacy and privacy. The idea of this private wall that kind of wraps around the rehabilitation centre, almost like a protective blanket, giving another level of safety to the users of the building. And these kiln-shaped roofs, so kind of playing on the traditional shape of a ceramic kiln, but also trying to bring light into a building that can't necessarily have many windows on the external facade. And so looking at the site plan in a bit more detail, so the site kind of borders onto Minor Park, which is a very public park, and we only actually had to develop part of the site. So I proposed to have a housing development, which would probably be phased to kind of help fund the rehabilitation centre and gallery spaces. But yeah, so the rehabilitation centre is up to the north, and then gallery spaces then down to the south. And then looking at the ground floor in a little bit more detail, I think what stands out straight away is the kind of the use of water. This was something intentional and something I wanted to carry through, because the idea of water is that it can be obviously very therapeutic, but it acts as a threshold where you can kind of see across it, but you can't get across it. And like I was talking about earlier, the idea of home. So this rehabilitation centre kind of is centred on this shared kitchen space. The courtyard is kind of in this particular shape, creating these nooks and crannies for different levels of privacy throughout the building. There's learning spaces and kind of individual ceramic spaces on the outside, but then kind of key to the design was to have these studio apartments at the north of the plot. These were used to kind of give people using this service a little bit more independence, so they have a space of their own. They can get back on their feet, and it gives them better opportunities for the future. So looking down into the gallery space to the south of the site, the idea of having a gallery space was really important, because I think people using the rehabilitation centre can then display the work that they're creating. It gives them a kind of sense of control. It gives them something to be proud of. Yeah, and a place to kind of inspire other people as well to kind of follow in their footsteps. It also includes sort of cafe space, but in this kind of leg that kind of comes out, there'll be individual studio spaces, kind of kiln spaces, and then a shared kind of a bigger shared space for kind of lessons and stuff. And then the first floor plan is pretty similar. So this section kind of cuts through both rehabilitation and gallery space, and it kind of really wanted to emphasize this kind of journey from the unseen side of the building to this really public side of the building, and the kind of processes to get from one side to the other. So you start off with these kind of really private spaces of independence, where you can eventually kind of get the confidence to start collaborating and growing with other people. And eventually you can move into this public space where you kind of become much better at this art. You can master an art and inspire the next people that are coming after you. And then this was one of my kind of final images looking across the courtyard. This was the most intimate courtyard, the most private one in the rehabilitation centre. And then this was at our north side, kind of in the private gardens of the studio spaces. And then this image is looking back up to the gallery space, which you can see on the left, and then you kind of get a hint of what the rehabilitation centre looks, but kind of really put an emphasis on those kiln-shaped roof lights. And then this was a series of images that kind of goes from north to south in the site, I guess. So spaces to collaborate and spaces for independence, spaces to grow, to master, to inspire, and then discover. And I think one thing that I found really difficult was how do you, like I said earlier, how do you create such a private building in a public site? And when looking at the site plan, there's almost an entrance from every single angle of the site. So it had to be in a kind of public place within the site. So in order to do that, I came up with a kind of few small moves which made a big difference for the users of the building. So like I said, the idea of vegetation and planting was used to kind of direct people to walk in a certain way. So you would understand that this is a private building because the entrance wasn't very accessible. And then as soon as you enter the rehabilitation centre, you're kind of met with the water from the courtyard. It gives this kind of real sense of tranquility and peacefulness. Yeah, and then looking at the site plan, so you can kind of start to understand the materials a little bit more. So the context was kind of 2 to 3 story Victorian houses. A lot of it was red brick. So it kind of made sense to tie in with the context with the site, but obviously it's also a ceramic art studio. So you kind of have that benefit of having these natural red bricks to make up this public part of the site. For the rehabilitation centre, I wanted it to be something much different and something that was more subtle. So I chose this really light sandstone, kind of, the building almost looks like it's emerging from the ground and kind of fades into the background a little bit more to really emphasize the private nature. And yeah, so that's kind of it for my my uni project. But I've kind of come up with these points that are kind of a reflection for me. I think it's been almost 3 years since I've done the project now. So I've had kind of time to think about it and time to reflect. So number one is the street sex work is different to normal sex work. It comes with deeper layers of dangers and inequalities. I think this is such a sensitive topic, and it's really important to kind of define the difference between people working on the streets and people working within a safe environment. Number two is, in order for your feminism to be intersectional, it must include sex workers in the conversation. I think this one is really key because a lot of kind of feminist figures kind of completely exclude sex workers, kind of anti-sex workers. And I think ultimately, if you're a feminist and your beliefs are that women deserve to be treated equally, you can't just choose which women you want to be treated equally. I think this needs to include everyone. And when we're talking about feminism, this also includes sex workers as well. Number 3, by listening to sex workers and hearing their voices, it makes the industry safer for everyone. I think this one I could have definitely benefited from in my project. So I did reach out to some Bristol charities, but obviously, as you can imagine, this is such a sensitive topic, and like they can't pass any information on. I think if I was to do it again, I would definitely try to get more involved with some kind of wider scale charities rather than ones that are kind of working really hard in Bristol already. Number 4, decriminalisation of sex work means working without the fear of persecution and gaining support from others without fear of persecution. So I think this one is kind of talking about how a lot of sex workers won't report when they feel like they're in danger or whether they have been in danger because of the nature of street sex work and it being criminalised means that the outcome of reporting the incident might be worse than the incident was in the first place. And I think also by reaching out to people who are not sex workers, they're often reluctant to help because it might mean they get into trouble themselves as well. So I think bringing this element of decriminalisation will make it safer for everyone. And then number 5, sex work is work. By taking away this right, you're instantly putting people at danger and not protecting them. I think a lot of people think by taking away kind of sex work and kind of stripping and things within this nature, they think that they're ultimately helping people. But at the end of the day, people have to pay their bills, people have families to support. And by taking this away, they're going to have to make money in other ways. So I think it's not always making the situation better for people. And then finally is the kind of main point, I think. So I've said, if society is so concerned about the way the women are making money from sex to survive, then why don't we simply make the element of surviving easier? It's just a no-brainer to me. I think this is a much deeper problem than what it kind of just seems on the ground. And I think this is a political problem and there's people in government who are making these decisions for these people. So I think it's much deeper than what it seems. So I was kind of asked to talk about what I'm doing next. So unfortunately, I didn't find a practice that specialises in street sex workers, but I did start working for a practice called Stonewood Design. They're based in Wiltshire and they're a really, really amazing practice and have some amazing projects as well. And I really enjoyed my time there. I was working there for 2 years and I kind of worked on a number of different projects, but they kind of specialise in highly crafted, kind of detailed architecture that, yeah, give me a huge range of different projects and different experiences, and I really enjoyed myself there. But then now I've moved on and I'm living in London in the London School of Architecture. So I started in September, so I'm only in my first year, but like I said at the beginning, I'm also working for AHMM 3 days a week. It's actually still a full-time course, so it's really full on, but hopefully worth it in the end. But it's kind of a new university that is trying to open opportunities for kind of widening the access of architecture students, especially financially. It's been really helpful. But it's kind of, I think I just touched on a few of the projects I've worked on this year because I think my final year project has kind of led me onto these. It's almost a continuation of what I was doing in my undergrad. So my first kind of, it was like a few weeks project, really quick, snappy project in our Design Cities module. And we basically had to tackle a particular problem in Hackney in East London. And I was looking at domestic violence because it's something that is particularly high in Hackney compared to the rest of the UK. So the design was kind of a pop-up barge that travels along the River Lee in Hackney, and it aims to kind of meet the number of needs of different people within East London, but particularly for victims and survivors of domestic violence. And then next, I'm working, just finished a project within my design think tank, so it's a group project, and it was called Connecting Communities. So our kind of aim was to create this radical shift in the way that people have influence in where they live. So we came up with an idea of creating a thing called commons, where basically businesses and residents kind of opt in, and through a kind of process of democratic collectivism, and they all have a say on what happens in their local area in terms of kind of development, and it aims for kind of small scale developments, kind of incremental change over long periods of time. I'm also looking into social class in architecture, and looking at the idea of kind of entitlement syndrome within the architecture profession, which is something that isn't really talked about very much, but I'm in the middle of researching that now. And yeah, like I said, so I'm working for AHMM. At the moment, I'm working on a manual for the practice through my university. So I'm looking at gender equality, and I'm basically trying to dissect gender identity and gender equality within the architecture profession, and looking at how AHMM as a practice are trying to tackle those issues. Yeah, so finally, before I finish, I just wanted to post a couple of things that I would suggest people look at. So Swarm, they're a kind of grassroots collective which are led by sex workers. This is from their Instagram account. They post up a lot of information for sex workers, but also if people are genuinely interested in understanding them a little bit more, it's really helpful. But I think the one that I really love is Sarah Pascoe's podcast, Sex, Power, Money. Obviously, Sarah Pascoe is a comedian. She's not a sex worker, but she's got this kind of couple of series, and she talks to a number of different people, from sex workers to kind of health professionals, just a huge range of people kind of trying to dissect these stigmas of sex workers. And it's really helpful. And I wish that it came out before I'd done my project, because it would have been really helpful. But no, I would definitely recommend that everyone should go and watch it. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Time for questions. Thank you so amazing. For me, it makes me so proud to see one of my students talking so confidently about such a tricky subject and gaining in confidence since kind of we started. I'm going to start with a question, you don't mind, because I saw this from the beginning, if that makes any sense. And I've got a small question for Sian. Yeah. How did you feel when you were starting looking at this subject? What were the kind of initial feelings that came to you when you started kind of exploring this? And how have you grown after kind of this kind of 3.5 years, 4 years looking into this subject and actually being part of who you are?
I think when I started looking at it, it was something that I was really interested in. And I think it kind of, after researching, I became a lot more interested in it. But I think it's such a touchy topic and really sensitive that you don't want to tread on people's toes. You need to kind of make sure that you're not the voice for everyone. And I think kind of that's what makes it really tricky. But I think when I started doing the research, I wasn't sure what this would end up as. I started looking at the issue and looking at kind of ways out, I guess, but not out of the profession, but ways of kind of designing to help these. And I think it was really, really hard. But I think ultimately you have to do something that you're really passionate about, because it always comes through in the design. And I think looking back now, there probably are a few things I would have done differently. I think I'm a lot more open-minded. I probably went into it with my own prejudices and my own kind of biases. And I think looking back now, yeah, I have a lot more positive outlook on it, I think. So I think it really helped me as well, going through the kind of design process.
Thank you. I hope you all can hear me. Benedict, you had a question. So you want to go now? Should we open the floor? I'm just hoping you can hear me still.
Yeah, we can hear you. I think Elena's frozen.
I have frozen, but Benedict, have you got your question?
No, I was just clapping.
Ah, the word you're clapping. So any questions, anyone else?
Sorry.
Any questions for Sean? It could be about the subject in itself and or kind of the project.
I can jump in, sorry, I'm labelled as John, but it's Annie. I don't know whether Sian, you've heard about the current situation with closing the strip clubs in Bristol.
Yeah.
What's your take? I'd love to hear your take on that situation, because I know friends who work there and things like that, and there's a lot of politics and this has been going on for quite a while, so it'd be quite nice to hear your opinion, again, kind of on the sex topic.
Yeah, I was actually speaking to Benedict about this the other day. I wasn't actually aware that this strip club was owned by the not sex workers, strippers themselves, which I think is amazing. But I think it's really hard, because ultimately people think, like kind of what I touched on earlier, people think that taking away the service is making it safer for women, and it's making it like a better place for women to be. But at the end of the day, people enjoy doing this. People are making money from something that they love. And I think that taking that away is taking a human right away. And I think that people think that they're doing the right thing, basically, by taking that service away from them. But at the end of the day, people have to pay rent. People have lives and families to support. And I just think that it goes a lot deeper than what people think. And it just by checking it off your list, by saying this is something that we're going to do to help people, without talking to those people, is possibly the worst thing that you could do. So yeah.
Thank you. I think Elena.
Yeah,
She's back.
I'm not going to even attempt to put my camera just in case it blows up the whole computer. Any other questions, anyone here?
Hi, I have a question.
Go for it, Malik.
So I'm currently in second year of my part one, and I've kind of left university for this year, and I'm going to redo second year. But when I was in university during my whilst I was doing my project, I was doing mine based on male escorts and sort of the cruising culture in LGBT society. And one thing that an external critic told me was I had to make sure that I was being mindful of the idea of making a space, like trying to navigate the line between making architecture and creating a new ecosystem and kind of controlling the flow of people. And I feel like that's also something that you've done really well in your project, where you kind of managed to facilitate a certain atmosphere without, I don't know if this is making sense, or this is a really elementary question. But I kind of struggled to, I don't know, find the line between like designing a building and trying to make things happen with people, like kind of make people feel a certain way. And I just wanted to know if you had any sort of tips, or like how you kind of navigated that yourself.
Yeah, that's a good question. I found that really hard as well. I think to think spatially when you're thinking of these kind of sensitive topics is really, really difficult. Especially like for me, not being a sex worker, it's really hard to kind of put yourself in those positions and try to understand the needs of other people. But I guess the way I would, if you kind of just find the narrative, it's a student project, so it's obviously, there's going to be things which are probably not realistic, but I think you have to put a narrative to it, and yeah, basically put yourself in those situations and say, if I was in that position, what would I want? And then I think put in like every little thing. So I was thinking about, if I was in this room, how would I want to feel? And how do you bring that through? So that might be through the shape, that might be through the kind of light that's coming through the space. But something that I'm particularly interested in is kind of materiality. And in a lot of these images you can't see, but inside the public building was kind of much more of a harsh concrete kind of shell, I guess. But in the rehabilitation centre, it uses a lot of timber and kind of light elements. And I feel like that element of kind of touch and texture, it can make you feel a particular way. And particularly in kind of sensitive design, I think that's really important. And I'm kind of working on projects of this kind of sensitive nature in work now. And these conversations are coming up as well in that thing. So it's kind of nice to know that when you're doing it as a student, you're not just with your student hat on. This is real life as well. So I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And I thought your project was incredible as well. So
thank you.
Any other questions from the floor?
I think there's one in the chat, Elena.
You say, can you read it just in case I open the chat and blows my computer?
Okay.
This is so, we are live into that sensitive element.
Do you think this approach could move forward with the idea of micro industries becoming more prevalent after COVID due to the number of people losing their jobs, and especially with sex workers, and to help with the higher number of women needing to find extra money at the moment and possibly struggling with losing money by coming out of sex work? Sorry, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I do think so. Coming out of COVID, there's going to be so many people, obviously, that are struggling a lot more. Like in that, when I was talking in the beginning, I was talking about how the impact that austerity has had on kind of sex workers, and how the numbers of sex workers increased. Like, we don't know the actual number, but we know that they increased a lot. And I think, but this element of decriminalisation makes criminalisation makes it really difficult, particularly for where you're talking about kind of micro industries. I think because people can't work under the same roof, it makes that really difficult. And because essentially, if two sex workers want to work from home together in the same environment, that's automatically classed as a brothel, which seems kind of bizarre, because ultimately they're probably doing that through safety. So I do think that it's really hard. I would like to think that the kind of idea of decriminalisation will come to the forefront. I know a lot of politicians are pushing for it, and therefore will make this easier. But I think until those sort of stigmas go away, we're not gonna see it. I think a lot of people don't want to support sex workers because they're scared that it means they're users of a sex worker, which comes with a whole range of problems as well. But until people actually start talking about it, I'm not sure if we'll see it more prevalent, to be honest. But...
Thank you. So it was me that asked the question.
Okay.
So I'm cooking and I've got children coming in and out.
Brilliant.
I think it was also about just the idea at the moment of, because a lot of people, including sex workers, have lost their jobs, that actually your idea of the micro industry, albeit a few years ago, to help sex workers would actually be something now which could come more to the fore, because kind of post-COVID is much more about actually people trying to find a way to look at alternatives. So it's actually really interesting to put what you've looked at into the current kind of situation, and possibly one of the ways to, as we come out of lockdown and everything else, that actually the micro industry could be more supported as a way of being able to exit working on the street. and it was just really interesting. Just that kind of, you know, almost the two extremes of the hidden, as you said it, and the incredibly popular artistic product enjoyed by the gentrified, the people in these areas which were used. So I just wondered if there might be some scope in how it could actually be taken forward in the current situation. But it was a really interesting talk, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that, I mean, to be honest, I haven't thought about it in terms of kind of COVID and post-COVID, so it's interesting to kind of relate it back to that. But yeah, I think ultimately it would be really exciting and creating, yeah, much more safer spaces for people. So I think it would be amazing to see that. But yeah, like I said, I think until the people in the positions of power kind of start these conversations, which is hopefully soon, but yeah, until that happens.
No, thank you. We thought they'd started them 20 years ago in Liverpool, but they stopped.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have got a follow-up question for yourself. When I started, I saw you 4 years ago starting this project. You tentatively were even trying to consider how would you know, how you would visualize that, how you will make it explicit, something which was very hidden. And you have become a tremendously confident woman, which has got a very, very strong views about how this should kind of be approached. And clearly it has shaped you as kind of going forward. What learnings would you like to leave us here today from that experience, especially from the, you know, the kind of the audience that we have today, which is kind of intergenerational? What learnings did you have, and what experiences or kind of learnings it has kind of helped you shape to who you are today, a very confident female that knows exactly what position should be taken in such a sensitive subject?
Yeah, I think I did really struggle at the beginning, and I think that's probably down to lack of confidence of my own views. And I do think going through the project, they became very clear and kind of grounded. But I do think having time away from the project now, over the last kind of 3 years, there's just so much that's happening in the world that kind of makes you angry and makes you want to see the change that you're kind of living through and kind of seeing every day. I genuinely think just seeing these kind of inequalities is what has made me more passionate about it, and therefore talk more confidently about my project, because it's something that I am actually genuinely really passionate about. And I think, yeah, in terms of like kind of student projects, I think that's really important, because to come out of my final year with those kind of opinions, it put me in such a better position going into kind of the world, I think. My opinions were much more grounded, and yeah, I think it just kind of propelled me into this world of gender equality, which was obviously something I was thinking about before. Being a kind of woman in architecture as well, I think you have to be thinking about it, because there's no way of not thinking about it. But yeah, I don't know. I think being engaged with the world and getting angry isn't always a bad thing, because you can kind of come out the other side with your passions being kind of coming to the forefront. And I think with all the bad things that are happening in the world at the moment, you kind of have to come out with it with a positive mindset, and it tells you what you really care about and what you don't care about. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got 3 minutes left. One final question before I do the closing remarks. No questions. So thank you so much, Sean. I wanted to leave you
Elena?
with one last thing, comment.
Elena,
Yes.
I think there was one question from Kat. She isn't getting quick enough.
Kat.
Yeah.
Yes, I can see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for putting these talks on. I think they're absolutely fantastic, and I'm particularly interested in this one. I was actually living in Yorkshire when it was the crossbow killer, and I ended up doing my dissertation on a place in society for women in street prostitution. So it was wonderful to see, yeah, the same kind of like idea and the thoughts coming through, and yeah, unfortunately, I'm hoping that there's a possibility of getting the recording afterwards, because I had to take a telephone call, so I missed part of it. But I guess this question as well for Elena, because I mean, I found it really difficult when I came up with this proposal, and the same sort of thing, that exploratory, not sure where it's going to go. And yeah, I had some interesting kind of things coming from the university that, yeah, were pretty sexist. Anyway. And I just wonder, you know, like there's all these fantastic ideas that come out of university, and like some real, you know, like wonderful design thesis on real life sites. And I just wonder, you know, I feel like there's like lost opportunities as well, like with understanding where funding streams come from and like how to actually make these projects possible. So I suppose it's just a kind of like open question, you know, like how can all this research and how can all this like wonderful work actually be implemented in real life? Because I feel like there's a real sort of yeah, there's a kind of disconnect between all this like incredible ideas and work that gets put in and like it never gets done. So, you know, how can we really push that in order to get the funding and to learn about the funding and to, I don't know, maybe even have universities back us if we're, you know, like trying to get through to politicians. Yeah.
So I think that's one formation. I think the first thing I would say, Kat, sorry, and I'm trying to kind of make sure like the machine is working. So thank you so much for all of you to be so patient. But the first thing is kind of not being apologetic to encourage projects like this and exploration like this across any of my students or any of the students that come to us. I think I still remember the first time Sean and I were kind of trying to work out how to do it. And it's just sometimes it's getting your mindset and the discussions. But I think everybody, even in the group that kind of Sean was part of, was kind of, you know, it took a while because sometimes it's very difficult subjects and sometimes very difficult to speak about it. But I think kind of I would say that Sean found the strength to be able to do so and to be able to grow as he went through the project. And it's also how we encourage those projects to happen, because the more there are, the more kind of, you know, it's part of the school environment and what we do. There is a lot of the projects that we do now as part of our Life Projects initiative with Bristol and the city, which are also kind of presented to politicians, and some of them are quite controversial. I'm telling you that because I've been dealing for the last month and a half. Some of my students have dared to come up with a better strategy than the council, and it has created a huge amount of problems around the communities. And for me, it's just how we manage the politics around it to make sure those projects still can continue happening, and kind of making sure that, you know, talks like this organized by students, and making sure that kind of all the people from the vice chancellor level to all kind of external speaker are able to, external stakeholders are able to participate is a way of starting those conversations and making them more visible possible. But it's just not, if you don't know how to do it, it's working out together a way of how to do it and represent those things, which might be much more difficult to do so. Would you say that's how we did it, Sean?
Yeah, I think obviously this particular topic is kind of really hard to bring into the real world and kind of put it into knowing who to talk to is really, really difficult with this kind of topic, I think. So kind of using all the resources possible in UE and Bristol was kind of as far as I could take this, but obviously super helpful as always. But yeah, I do think it's really hard to know how to bring these projects into the real life, and it would be interesting to know who to talk to. But yeah, I think the nature of this project brings another kind of level of difficulty for that. But yeah, I think.
But the other thing as well, Kat, is being able to present back to other students projects like this. So we present the kind of this portfolio, so exhibit it as a good practice, and being able that make sure that they are not apologetic to follow something that they think is worth exploring from an architectural perspective, even if it's a complex subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great, and it's just how to take that into real life so that you can actually supply a building to people who need it. I suppose as well, it's getting the funding, and I suppose if there's enough of it, and if there's enough of that happening, and if there's enough talk about it, then like maybe it can't be swept under the carpet so much, and there's gonna have to be money allocated, and it's complex issues. It's not it's not simple by any means, and yeah, just but there just doesn't seem to be the money there to actually make it happen.
It's tricky, I would say. Yes, it's much trickier.
Yeah.
But there is a massive drive now, even by universities, in relation to equality and diversity. So there will be much bigger options going forward in terms of what the universities would do. My only difficulty will be is to make sure they are meaningful enough for all students, because that will be the strength of kind of series like this are tremendously strong, because it brings such a diverse set of perspective. And I personally have learned a lot in the last 2 days from the students' perspective that I've already starting taking back to the way we do things. So I think we are 4 minutes over. We are going to thank Sian for being kind of such a brave, confident, and fabulous female that has been able to talk to us about kind of her experience with her Part 1 project that is clearly informing herself as a female, but also how she's taken her architectural career forward and how she's engaging with these wicked and tricky issues and very complex. Also, thank you, Annie, for hosting the series, the ID Network, and all of you for attending. Annie will be posting links to the talk for the rest of the week in social media, and we've got 2 more talks. Tomorrow, I think Suleiman is chairing the next one. And then please follow us in the social media links that we will have. And there is always kind of opportunities to grow the team. So Annie's always looking for helpers and people who wants to get involved. And for myself, I kind of say thank you so much. Thank you for the array of fantastic questions. Thank you to Sian and to some of my fantastic alumni and associate lecturers and practitioners that we have had here and the wider public. And thank you so much as well to the UE Bristol and the Student Union for funding this event. And please don't forget to sign up to the other events. It has been a fantastic learning experience this week for all of us. And thank you so much for the fabulous group of people that we are having this week. Sian, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for asking me to come.
I don't know if
Bye.